Okay, our reflection this morning. Stephen, I believe. Stephen Fisk,
Yes. Thank
over
you.
to you.
Good morning, everybody. Reflection. We human beings seem to have the capacity to silo ourselves off in a polarized mindset and ignore and exclude other differing or alternative perspectives. I believe this exclusion and ignorance derives from socialized and enculturated indoctrination stemming from historically formed patterns of thoughts and norms handed down through generations. The inherited cultural narrative becomes entrenched in our psyche as our defining identity. Enclosed in its own isolated mindset, the inherited cultural narrative can lose touch with the broader reality and become the source of exclusive prejudice and implicit bias based around a false narrative fueled by greed, power, racism, and the quest for dominance and empire. We become motivated to maintain this identity at all costs, even when based on untruth, because that is what we have come to know as our core belief. We suffer a cognitive dissonance when actual factual reality is revealed, which differs from that core belief. We become motivated to aggressively defend our ignorance for fear of facing the pain of being exposed and found wrong. This morphs into an addictive psychosis of polarized denialism and the obsession to maintain that ignorance and remain embedded in its status quo. This affliction then becomes a block to exploring broader understandings and new perspectives. This motivated ignorance blocks the progress of democratic society, as well as a future of justice, peace, and environmental health and sustainability. We have seen this denialism and motivated ignorance in the tsunami of lies, accusations, and political polarizations of Trump and his MAGA cult of white supremacy, in the big lie, the incitement of the January 6th insurrection, and the ongoing Republican purge of voting rights in multiple states. We see it most abhorrently in Trump's praising of his hero and mentor, Russian tyrant Vladimir Putin, and his murderous invasion of Ukraine. Trump was socialized by his Nazi-supporting racist father and his father's egregiously corrupt, discriminatory, and litigious businessman tyranny and the manipulation, propaganda, and power mongering of the KGB. They both embraced the demagogue and dictator mindset. It is no wonder that the two of them formed a mutual admiration society, as Putin played Trump as his puppet. One of the embedded narratives in our dysfunctional civilizational construct is that of the alpha male. In mammalian groups of lions, tigers, wolves, and others, including the primates, an alpha male, who is usually the most physically dominant, takes the commanding dominator role. In the law of the jungle, which is kill or be killed, hunt or be hunted, we humans become predators to hunt, kill, eat, and survive. The alpha male was usually the lead predator, warrior, protector, and would defend his position in battle to the death. We have lived a long history of alpha male dominance and patriarchal, hierarchical governing systems. Pharaohs, kings, warlords, land barons, dictators, conquerors, colonialists, slave owners, empire builders, imperialists, oligarchs, religious patriarchs, and predatory capitalists have dominated and authored large chapters of our human history, manipulating the masses to suit their wishes. Trump and Putin are vigorous remnants of this disastrous disorder and have reversed our human history back to the jungle, seen through the claws and fangs of predatorial demagoguery. The rise of Trump and the tyranny of Putin and his bloodletting invasion of Ukraine in his goal of rebuilding the Russian Empire is a call to the heightened involvement of concerned citizenry worldwide to realize the dangers of authoritarianism and to once again denounce and delete from our human experience the scourge of war making. It is the call to absolutely refute the greed, evil, and corruption of despots, war makers, imperialists, and aggressors. We are called to reach across our divisions and boundaries to embrace our common humanity and the universal moral and ethical values that all religions profess, and that is at the root of pluralistic democracy. It is the immediate call to unite as one people to confront and overcome the myriad issues that we face: war, pandemic, economic disparity, climate change, racism, classism, and the need for the immediacy of conversion to renewable energy for the health and existential continuance of life on this beautiful planet, Earth, as well as to purge the old non-sustainable inherited systemic dysfunction. This is a time of extraordinary and challenging transition. The old clings and fights for its survival, as the new clings and fights for its arrival. We human beings are struggling to achieve and embrace a new paradigm where interdependence, cooperation, honest dialogue, adherence to factual truth, respect across differences, nonviolence, the striving for justice, the establishment of world peace, living by the power of love, and earth stewardship must be the pillars of a new global identity. The challenges we are facing in today's turbulent world implore us to rise to a new level of realization and awakened consciousness. Let us take strength from the incredible courage of the Ukrainian people to fight for their country and their freedom, and be thankful for the incredible generosity, compassion, and welcoming of those nations receiving the influx of refugees. Let us gain inspiration from the immense goodness within the human spirit that shines through, even in the midst of death, destruction, pain, and panic. Let us find strength in each other, in building the unity of world community, in the enrichment of diversity. May we open our minds to see the unlimited potential for goodness and wholeness that we human beings are born with, and feel our common heart, our inclusive humanity. Let us put our prayers, our actions, our donations, our talents, our activism in the quest for peace at the forefront of our hearts and minds. And let us always reach for love to overcome hate, and for the light of God of many names and forms to shine through the darkness of war and destruction, and forever end the reign of dictators and demagogues. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. Beautifully done. Great food for thought. Thank you very much. And now, is anybody introducing Linda? I neglected to ask earlier.
Well, I could introduce Linda since she's a good friend and I've known her for a long time.
Okay.
Linda is a dear heart. She is a person of sharp intellect and deep understandings and perspectives. She's a person who reaches for the big picture. And she's a retired professor of many years, and a loving, beautiful soul. So please welcome Dr. Reverend Linda Groff.
Okay. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Wait. Oh, good. Okay, great. Well, thank you all so much. And Stephen kind of gave some of my talk, which he did a beautiful summary there of many issues. And he's working on his own peace book, which will go into all of that even more. So he is an old dear friend of mine as well. And So I would just like to first say I'm very happy to be here again. I've spoken to ICUJP, I think maybe 3 times before. And my presentation, I don't know if we can put up on the screen the PowerPoint. I don't see it. Okay, wait a minute. Yeah, great. Okay, and then can you make it a whole screen? Somebody? Okay, I just see it. I don't see it as a whole screen. I don't know if somebody can do that. I have a Mac computer, and for some reason I have difficulty changing the slides from my end. I've had this difficulty before, so somebody else has it on their screen and will change the slides for me. But well, should we go ahead and start, even though I don't see full screen?
Yes, I think he is trying. I can see the cursor moving around. Here we go.
Oh, there we go. Okay, great. All right. So basically, the topic, it's a rather long title: Challenges to Democracy from Right-Wing Nationalist Populist Strongman Movements, and then focusing within that on the US case of Donald J. Trump and ongoing Trumpism, which is an ongoing issue in our country about democracy. And then I added more, which I don't know if I'm going to have time to get to. I would be happy if we don't get to the whole thing on Ukraine to come back another time and do a much more in-depth discussion about Ukraine. But, you know, I think Ukraine has got the hearts of the world behind them, their struggle to maintain their right to exist as a country. And there's, you know, and Trump and Putin have been big buddies. You know, Trump has never criticized Putin once in his life, and he's more quite ready to just try to destroy anyone who doesn't support him. So, you know, there's a whole case there, interesting issue there about their whole relationship. But anyway, can we go? I'm just going to say next each time. Okay, so basically, I'm going to start out by going through the whole thing about Trump and Trumpism. And then I'm going to also at the beginning and the end look at what are some of the issues about how we have to strengthen democracy if we want it to survive, because there have been global movements in a number of countries for this right-wing, more nationalist strongman tendency. And, you know, Trump represents that, but unfortunately it's happening in many countries today. And actually, just in terms of Ukraine, I'm hoping that maybe Ukraine is giving a big boost again to the importance of democracy and a people's right to choose their own government and so on. And that this will help to, you know, revitalize democracy around the world. So that's sort of the big picture context in which I'm presenting this. Okay, next. So a few quotes about, and can you give me 5-minute warning when I'm getting out of my time? Okay, so these are a few quotes. Winston Churchill: democracy is the worst form of government except for all the others that have been tried. And I think this is the problem. Democracy is very imperfect, and I'll go through some of that. But is there a better system? And I think we're still trying to find what is a better economic system as well. And these are very difficult questions, and we don't have total answers. But democracy needs to keep evolving if it's going to survive, just like anything else. And then this is the late Elijah Cummings in US Congress saying, and who passed away. And he said, when we are dancing with the angels, we will be asked, what did you do to sustain democracy? And then Madeleine Albright, and this, I've been trying to get this quote again because I had it earlier and I can't seem to find it again, but it's something about democracy doesn't die overnight, but drip by drip. And I think under Trump's administration, we saw drip by drip every one of our democratic institutions challenged over and over and over, and people had to put up a resistance to every attempt that Trump would do to override our democratic traditions. Next. Okay, so again, I've spoken to you guys before, and I want to just praise all of you for your organization and the great work that you do to bring people together from different faith traditions and to support war prevention and peace, which is all very important in our community and world. My own background for this is just that I'm a concerned citizen, and I taught in a political science department at Cal State Dominguez Hills for over 40 years. And I taught things on peace and conflict resolution and futures and intercultural interface. So, you know, from the day that Trump walked down that escalator and started attacking Latinos and Mexicans, as rapists or whatever. I mean, I thought, good God, here we go. This is not going to be good. So I've been following everything Trump's been doing through the whole thing, feeling like it's my civic duty to try to do that. Next. Okay, so the founding of the US was quite imperfect. There were 3 groups that were left out, but we still had some hope in the founding in terms of the principle of equality. But 3 groups that were not given full participation in the founding of the US were Blacks, who were brought here as slaves and sold into bondage against their will. Then Indigenous people who were already here and lost their lands over time more and more as Europeans and others came and moved west and were put on reservations. And then women who did not get the vote until the 19th Amendment in 2020. So we didn't start out with a perfect democracy by any means, and we still don't have one.
1920.
What?
You had 2020, it's 1920.
Oh yeah, you're right. Sorry about that. Good God, that would be much worse. Okay, all right. And then, but there was one thing embedded in the Constitution, and there's a museum, a new museum in Philadelphia on the American Revolution, and it really focuses on the theme that from the beginning we had the principle of equality for all citizens in the Declaration of Independence, even though we haven't always practiced it. So that has been a basis on which the US over time, sometimes we move forward and we move towards a more perfect union, and sometimes we move backwards. And, like we did with Trump, and we try to go back and say that only some parts of our country can be legitimate people to govern. So that's the kind of battle, and it's an ongoing one. It probably will never stop, but we need to move it forward again. I think you can only go backwards, by the way, so long, and then you have to move forward. So maybe I think the Ukraine thing could be the kind of shift that will start to move things in a new direction forward again, I hope. Okay, next. So the background context, and I want to just say, if I don't have time to get through everything, then I'd be happy to come back and do an in-depth thing, as I said, on Ukraine, but let's just see how far I can get here. So the background for Trump coming to power and getting the Republican nomination for president in 2016 was, I would call, a perfect storm of factors. We had before that, I mean, it's bizarre that sometimes I think the US is schizophrenic, because we had 8 years of Obama administration, the first Black president, which looked like we're moving forward. And then all of a sudden we elect Trump. So, that's kind of bizarre. And, he's had a sway over the whole Republican Party since then. So we have to figure out how to break through and get moving forward again. But one of the key things is the changing demographics of the country. By 2045, there will be no ethnic group, including whites, who will be in a majority. And so I think that people like Trump are using that to freak some white people out, that, oh my God, they're going to lose power and what are they going to do? But there's a lot of other things also happening. One argument was that 9/11 created a culture or climate of fear that Trump has played on. But there's also, we've had in recent years a really great increase in the gap between rich and poor. And I think there's a strong argument to be made that democracy requires a strong middle class. And the problem is that the middle class has been squeezed more and more. So if we want to revive democracy, we've got to figure out how the democracy can help all people, not just the very wealthy, because otherwise people won't see that democracy is supporting their interests. Another thing on the horizon is artificial intelligence and robotics, automation, and people may have fears about what will their jobs be in the future because of that. And then there's also been the proliferation of social media, where we have no regulation of it. And you can have endless conspiracy theories and lies on social media. And then people get on that and they follow one link to another, and before they know it, they're all involved in some kind of alternative reality that is challenging the system from the right. So, and Putin, by the way, in supporting Trump, totally took advantage of that, putting stuff on the social media to divide the US population further and further, which, Trump, I mean, you can say about Putin that he has no interest to support democracy because he views that also as a challenge to his authority. And he doesn't really want democracy in Russia either. Okay, okay, we can go on to the next. So it's important to look at the Trump administration also within the global context of right-wing nationalist, populist, strongman movements happening in a number of countries today. And so, which it seems to me, right-wing tradition seems to favor like a dominant ethnic group in a country, whatever that is, and then they scapegoat and blame all the minorities in a country, and women too sometimes, as being the problem, the source of all the problems. And these are just a few countries I have listed where this tradition has been happening recently. The US under Trump, UK under Brexit, France with Marie Le Pen, Hungary under Viktor Orban, by the way, who, you know, some on the right in the Republican Party have been saying that should be our model, which is to be more dictatorial and not support democracy. And that includes, what's his name in Fox News? You know who I mean? Anyway.
Tucker Carlson.
Tucker Carlson, who's just become a total supporter of like Putin, Viktor Orban, and let's get rid of democracy and just have dictatorship, because that way the right wing can stay in power, which is really kind of pathetic. But anyway, that's sort of where they've been going, some of them. Then Russia under Putin, I would argue, is not a communist. After the fall of communism in 1991, he became much more of a Russian nationalist, but a Russian nationalist who wanted to revive the old Soviet empire and its boundaries, but under Russian control, going back to the czars even. So it's possible Putin sees himself as another czar, perhaps. China under Xi Jinping is also moving towards more authoritarian control for a third time to head China. So that's another issue. Then Turkey under Erdogan, Egypt under El-Sisi, India under Modi, the Philippines under Duarte, Brazil under Bolsonaro, etc. So all these countries are moving more towards the right in recent years, along with Trump. So you can see it's a global issue, and it's a really big question. Why is this happening everywhere, and what do we have to do to shift that trend? Okay, Trump's campaign, 2015, especially 2016, he began his whole thing by attacking Mexicans and appeals to white fear of other minorities. And he claimed that he had no ties with Russia. However, there were over time validated about 120 to 140 ties during just the campaign of Trump. And, you know, some people have mixed views of Hillary Clinton, but she in 2011 was supporting democracy protests in Russia. So Putin really hated Hillary Clinton and was determined. And I think also, as Stephen mentioned earlier, that Trump really became kind of a puppet of Putin, because he never once criticized Putin. And he wanted, you know, the whole time that Trump was running for office, he was secretly negotiating with the Russians to build a Trump Tower in Moscow, but of course didn't admit any of that and was interested in that for his own financial benefit and so on. So, and then Trump refused to turn over his tax returns and still hasn't done that. Let's see. So basically, when the bottom line is, when the different people were, a bunch of people were running to be the Republican candidate for president. And then when Trump was also running, they all said that Trump was unfit for office. And then as soon as Trump got the nomination, they all turned around and then became total supporters of.
We seem to have lost you, Linda. You seem to be muted.
Oh no, really? Oh dear. Uh-oh. I'm trying to see how, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes, you're back now.
I didn't
know.
lose her.
Okay, I didn't know what happened. Okay, next.
It was fine with me.
Okay, good. Okay, next. Sorry, I don't know quite what happened. Okay. All right, so Trump's, I'm just going to go through this quickly. And I did talk to you, all of you, earlier a bit about Trump's first two terms, and I'm going to go over that extremely briefly here. But he began with a lie. He started out by saying he had bigger people at his inauguration than Obama did, which is, you know, and of course he did not. Okay, so So Trump began with derogatory comments on Mexicans, Latinos, et cetera, and continued to do that for his whole term. And then, so he also made derogatory attacks from the beginning on the media. And Trump always called the media the fake news, except he was really the fake news, because he became, he doesn't have a strong commitment to the truth of facts or anything else. And that is dangerous for democracy. So Trump also attacked intelligence services, the media, eventually even the military, anybody that might be able to hold accountable. And so, as I said, I did an earlier presentation to this group and a few others on nonviolent resistance movements in the beginning with Trump when he took power. Next. Okay, so Trump's first 2 years led to the Mueller investigation of Trump because of these, concern about ties of Trump to Russia, to quite a large number of Russians. And by the way, I'm not anti-Russian. I have been to the Soviet Union several times on people-to-people diplomacy groups. I've gone out of my way to meet Russians and Chinese at international conferences, to meet people I wouldn't normally necessarily get to talk to, and so on and so forth. And the Russian people have always suffered. So one can have a lot of empathy for the Russian people. And now they're going to be having a horrible time to deal with the legacy of this war in Ukraine, because a lot of them are not being told the truth within Russia. So I have a lot of empathy for the Russian people also, as well as obviously the Ukrainian people who are just going through devastating times. And that's a little aside, but I want to make that point. So the Mueller investigation into Trump's possible ties during the campaign with Russians went on from 2017 to 2019, and then the Mueller report came out, and it had two parts. The first part concluded that there wasn't enough evidence to prove collision between the two countries, although Trump refused to provide any documents to the Mueller investigation, so they didn't really have a lot of information they needed. And that's the second part concluded there were 10 possible obstruction of justice areas that could be investigated further. But then the next problem happened is that the Mueller report was given over to the new Attorney General, William Barr, who then did his own summary of what was in it and inaccurately summarized it to be favorable to Trump. So that kind of ended the whole, it didn't go further than where it probably should have. And then there were hearings in Congress, and some people in the administration testified, but Trump told everybody not to, and didn't turn on any documents to the investigation in Congress either. So I think to this day, there are still big questions about what Putin has on Trump. And I hope someday we find the total story out, but at least, there are at least a couple aspects. One was that Trump wanted a Trump Tower Moscow. Another is that I believe that Trump has always seen Putin and Kim Jong-un in North Korea as kind of his models, because Trump really doesn't appreciate democracy, and he has wanted to emulate more Putin. And at every international conference, by the way, when there was, international leaders, Trump always made sure to have a private meeting with Putin where there were no notes to be taken and so on. So, I still don't think we have the full story of that relationship. All right, to understand what happened under Trump, I think we have to understand his psychology and his extreme narcissism a bit. And then if we look at all these other leaders in other countries where there's more right-wing things happening, I guess we have to say maybe there's a little too much narcissism going on in the world. But anyway, Trump really seems to largely be able to promote himself. He's known, these are things that people say about him, okay, that he doesn't have a lot of empathy. For example, I think one of the worst travesties was the separating of children from their parents at the border. And now you have the horrible thing of, it's a very different situation totally in Ukraine, where women and children are fleeing just to save the children. And the men, and a fair number of women, by the way, are fighting in Ukraine. And there was something I heard recently, just as an aside, that one of the conditions for an effective resistance movement against a stronger power is that you have a moral issue on your side and so on, but also that you have women involved in the movement, and you have that definitely in Ukraine. So I think that's an interesting aspect about why they're you know, even more strongly resisting invasion. Okay, Trump is sometimes, also back to Trump, he's sometimes called a malignant narcissist, meaning he's not just focusing about himself and promoting himself all the time, but if he's, you know, but he wants to take revenge against anybody who dares to challenge his power. And so if he's reelected in 2014, a fair number of people have said that he will take revenge on people, and they'll be Democrats, other people, but they could probably well be anyone in, you know, the Republican Party as well. And some people, by the way, couldn't stomach Trump and left, and they're called never Trumpers. And, you know, some of them formed various groups to try to oppose Trump. And so you have to give credit to them as well. Some people say Trump is a sociopath because he attacks all minorities and women. He definitely seems to be a pathological liar. He doesn't seem to have any shame about lying to promote himself or to dump on other people. And he doesn't have respect for women either. You know, I have a whole bunch of quotes on all the different groups he's dumped on, but you know, he cheats and lies to win. And this is another unfortunate, by the way, there's a whole book, by the way, he had someone take his exams to get into Wharton, and there's a whole book about how he cheats when he plays golf to win as well. So, you know, it seems to be fairly pervasive in his life. So to expect him to change would be a miracle. I mean, some people I know say we should pray for Trump and we should pray for Putin, and I'm not against that. But the realistic side of me says we should, you know, we should not expect a miracle if it's, you know, we should be open to a miracle, but let's deal with reality as well. Okay, so there's a book by a bunch of psychiatrists who normally don't get involved to publicly try to analyze someone who's they don't, you know, have as a patient, and then they should be quiet anyway. But they wrote a whole book called A Duty to Warn about Trump. They were that much alarmed, and then they came out with a second edition. Mary Trump is Putin's niece who got Trump screwed her father out of the inheritance of the family. So she became a psychologist, and she's written a couple books and has been very critical of Trump and has a lawsuit of many against Trump. But the biggest problem is that Trump was raised to always have to win, and he does not seem to understand. I mean, one of the things, we have to create a world where we can create win-win, not win-lose. And Trump only understands win-lose, and that's very dangerous for democracy. Okay, so you know, I think Trump is definitely a wannabe dictator if he gets back in power. I think now that possibly what's happened in Ukraine may be his undoing finally, because he seems to have been like Teflon who keeps getting away with stuff. But anyway, the next, okay. And even in his business operations, he often didn't pay off workers at the end. He declared bankruptcy 6 times. He always claims he's much wealthier if he wants to get big bank loans for his business, but that he's much poorer than he is if he's having to figure out how much taxes to pay. And this has people investigating his finances now that could also be, you know, on the horizon of a detriment to him. Because, you know, while he was president, I think one of the reasons he fought so strongly to stay in power, by the way, is because he got protected from lawsuits while he was president. And now he has a lot of lawsuits coming due against him. Okay, he also he gets other people to do his dirty work. And when they're caught, he says, well, I hardly knew the person. Like Michael Cohen, who was his fixer and lawyer for 10 years and paid off 2 women that he had affairs with before the 2016 election, so that they wouldn't talk. And then Michael Cohen went to jail for 3 years while Trump remained free as an unindicted co-conspirator, though. Okay, here's problems that many people have asked about, which is, why has the Republican Party been so loyal to him? And why, and we'll also look at the followers of Trump as well. And look at what is motivating them. And these are ongoing issues to examine. So in terms of the Republican Party, once Trump won, as I said, the Republicans all fell in line behind him. And Trump demands total one-way loyalty. If you cross him, he will try to destroy you. And then, you know, it seems like a lot of Republicans have just been quiet and been afraid to criticize Trump because they want to stay in power. But that's kind of pathetic if they've lost their principles, you know, what they stand for. But anyway, then finally the January 6th Capitol insurrection that happened, which was Trump's last effort to stay in power, which I'll go over various ones. Both McConnell, who heads the Senate, and McCarthy, who's from California, unfortunately, but who heads the House, Republicans, did come out and criticize Trump and say that he was partly to blame for what happened on January 6th. But then almost immediately, they changed their tune to support Trump again, although McConnell has never had much communication with Trump since then. And I think would like to probably get rid of Trump. But the Republican Party, because there's still been a number of people who support Trump, they've been afraid also to cross him. So, and then since Trump lost the election in November 2020, we've all seen a huge number of states controlled by Republican legislatures who passed a lot of legislation suppressing the vote, making voting more difficult for people of color, and not only trying to change who gets to vote, like eliminating voting early or mail-in ballots or places where you can put a mail-in ballot, all these types of things. But they've even passed legislation, which is even scarier, to figure out who gets to count the ballots, in a given state, and that Republicans should be in charge of that. So this is very challenging to democracy, and those laws are still in existence in a number of states. And we have elections coming up in 2020, 22, November, and again for president in November 24. And so this is a really big concern. And Biden and people have tried to get voting protections passed on a federal level, and so far have not been able to do it. And there's a couple Democrats, by the way, who have not been very helpful on this. So, okay, next. So next, going on to the psychology of Trump supporters. Why this loyal band of people seem to keep supporting him no matter what? And they seem to support him, I would say. Well, there's at least, I would say, 3 groups that have supported Trump strongly. One are business people who just like the fact that Trump tried to get rid of all regulations for business. So there may be some people under that category. And also they favor, the only legislation that got passed under Trump was tax cuts for corporations and the wealthy. So people who are in that category maybe thought that was great, but they need to look at the bigger picture too about what's happening to our democracy. So another group of loyal Trump fans, I believe, are people who have grievances, who feel that the system is no longer working for them. And that some people are getting extremely rich in this country, and that meanwhile, they're just trying to survive. And these are legitimate grievances. And these are some of the people who actually, I think, voted for Obama and then switched and voted for Trump. But their support for Trump is not based on facts, because you can't argue the facts with them, because they're not interested in that. They support Trump emotionally, because Trump is always expressing grievances, and they have grievances. And so they identify with Trump because of that, as sort of their spokesman for grievances and alternative facts. But unfortunately, sometimes they have, there's a maxim, like if you say something enough times, people will believe it. So Trump, since he lost the November 2020 election, keeps saying he won. And so his supporters then believe that he won. And some of them were then willing to go and commit violence in his name, even though it's all based on a fraud. Okay, then there is a third group of people that Trump has brought out of the woodwork. And these are what I would call racist white nationalists who, support the same right-wing views that Trump has, which Trump has tried to mainstream and support. And there's lots of examples of that, like, the thing was is it North or South Carolina, the Charleston thing, where he said, well, there were probably good people on both sides, even though there were right-wing Nazi people and someone got killed.
At Charlottesville.
Pardon? Yeah. Thank you. So anyway, on January 6th, the day the Electoral College gets final votes certified from each state, that's when Trump did his last, hurrah to try to stay in power this time. So next. So that's an attempt. There's an ongoing issue why people support Trump and why but these are my best effort at the moment to figure out some of the reasons. Next.
I don't know, for some reason it stopped functioning. I'm not sure why. I'll have to get out of let me.
Okay, well, the problem is I need to see the screen myself to talk.
Yeah.
I think. Do you want to, I don't know.
Hang on a second.
Sure. I have it. Yeah, I better, should we just take a little, everybody take a deep breath. And while we're pausing, why don't we say a little prayer for the people of Ukraine, and also I would say for the Russian people who, okay. So I'm going to just lead a quick little prayer here while we're waiting. So I always like to start with, dear Mother, Father, God, and Great Spirit, to honor all our traditions. So I just like to say that from our heart, we try to find every way we can to support the noble, very courageous efforts of the Ukrainian people to support their right to decide their own future and to be able to sustain themselves through what is horrible calamities to their country. And we want to also say a prayer for the Russian people, who we hope will increasingly find out what their government has been doing in their name and will be able to rise up. And my deepest hope is that eventually there may be more democratic traditions that might arise in Russia, because the Russian people have been really taken advantage of by the oligarchs and Putin, and that become exceedingly wealthy, but at the expense of the Russian people. So, and I just I give special prayers for both of them, and so it is. Amen. Okay. So now we're back to let's see where we are. Oh, we need to go back to a full screen if possible, but I can go ahead and talk. Oh, are we on the next? No, we're still on the same slide here. Yeah. Let's see here. If we click on the left with the next screen, this screen is 15, so we need to go to 16. If we can get that. Oh, is that 16?
Yeah. Hang on a second.
Wonderful. Thank you, Michael. Okay. All right. So here, now I'm just running through Trump's time in office so we get an overview of the damage done over time that got worse. So in 2018, we had an election where the Democrats took back at least the House, but not the Senate. We remained under Republican control. And then the first impeachment of Trump, and this relates to what's going on now in Ukraine, was because Congress approved money to go to Ukraine to help them defend themselves. And remember, this is that there was an election coming up in November 2020, and Trump wanted to win again and get reelected. And in 2014, Putin did go in and take over part of Ukraine, which was Crimea. In 2014, occupied it and claimed it as part of Russia, and then also put Russians in the eastern two provinces of Donbass is the area, and then use that to claim, at different times that those Russians were being attacked and that he therefore has to go in and protect their lives. And this is what he did again with the Ukraine war. He's basically created what's called a false flag to give a justification for him to go in and invade Ukraine earlier, as well as again in on February 24th is when, first he had all these troops put on the eastern, northern, and southern borders of Ukraine. And then on February 24th, he started having Russian troops invade Ukraine. So back now to Trump again. In the first impeachment of Trump was about the fact that the House of but Congress appropriated funds to help Ukraine defend itself. But then Trump used that to try to force the new president of Ukraine, who is Zelensky, who was a former comedian and actor, for heaven's sakes, who won the election as president and now has really risen to the occasion as head of his people. But in any case, he took over as the new president, and then Trump tried to say to him, you have to announce that you are publicly investigating Biden's son, Hunter Biden, And if you don't do that, I'm not going to allow these funds that you need for your defense to be given to you. That was the thing that happened. And that led to the first impeachment investigation of Trump, abusing basically his power as president. And so what happened in that is the House, voted for impeachment, and then it went to the Senate controlled by the Republicans, and they did not support convicting Trump. So then we go to the next slide. Just another problem for Trump was in the rise of COVID-19. And I think I've spoken to you, JP, before about that issue. But basically, Trump did not do a very good job as dealing with the COVID issue, because he wanted to say that the economy was doing great and that would help him get reelected. And obviously COVID led to harm to the economy got hurt by that. There was people having to stay at home for periods of time. And there were all kinds of other issues. And he was advocating quack therapies at times. And he was trying to, at one point, he was dominating all the newscasts, and so on, of the more qualified people to talk about the danger. Yay. Thank you, Michael. And then, so anyway, he had chaotic leadership. But the good thing that Trump did do is he at least started investigation for companies of creating a vaccine to counter, which then did come through. And then, so this one I'm going to, basically, I talked about this in the past, but, a lot of minorities and people who still had to work during the whole pandemic, they were hurt the most by the pandemic, and also women who had to stay at home to take care of their children and so on. Next. Okay, great. We're back on track here. So then we get to November 2020 and the presidential election. And here, Trump did a tactic he also did in 2016, as he said, the election would be rigged before the election. And this then supposedly he would have an excuse if he lost to say, well, I only lost because it was rigged, because he's always has to win. He was raised, he has to always win. So this is kind of pathetic and obviously anti-democratic behavior. But Biden won by 7 million votes, and it was someone appointed by Trump to deal with the security of the election because of the problems in 2016. He was a Republican. I don't know what that noise is. He was a Republican who said that this was the most secure election in their history. But of course, Trump and people freaked out about that. So Trump had said he had to win. And I read somewhere that Giuliani who was his personal lawyer, which is rather weird for a president to have, he told Trump to just say he won. So Trump anyway just started the big lie saying he won the election, and they started the Stop the Steal movement that Trump won and he should be reinstated as president and so on. And Trump followers very unfortunately believed this, and so Trump was desperate to stay in office and willing to do anything almost to stay in office, including trash all our democratic traditions and institutions. Next. Okay, I think. Next.
I don't know what's going on. It's stalled again. I have to stop it and start it. I don't know why. Sorry.
Okay, sorry about this. Let me see here. Unfortunately, let me see if I have my own I can start talking from, at least for a minute here. Well, oh, good Lord. Okay, here we go. Then we have to go to the next one, which is 18. If we can get that up. Yeah, that's going backwards, I think.
No, that's 18.
Oh, then 19. I'm sorry. Well, let me see. Maybe it's even 20.
Right.
Yeah, that's okay. Okay, now we're on to, this is where we want to be. Okay, so basically Trump is desperate to stay in power, partly because he wants to be a dictator, and all the time he was dumping on democracy to stay in power to begin with, and trash traditions that the law didn't apply to him. But in addition, I think Trump also very well knew that there was in the Department of Justice has this Office of Legal Counsel, and basically it sort of ruled but never decided through the courts that anyone who's president should not be indicted for anything while they're president, because that might distract them from their job as president. So Trump totally took advantage of this and was protected while he was in office for 4 years. And I think that he was probably also desperate because he knew there were a lot of pending lawsuits against him if he lost power. So that was no doubt an added motivation for him to do everything that he could find to try to stay in power. So he tried a whole bunch of coup attempts. And these are just a few of them. First of all, saying that the election would be rigged, but then there were at least 61 times that cases were, that Trump people went to court to say that the election results weren't fair. And all these cases were thrown out because they didn't provide any evidence. And then Trump started putting pressure on state Republican officials to find votes for Trump. Like there's a famous one that he went to the person in charge of elections in Georgia, Raffensperger, and he said to him, find me so many votes. That was what he would need to win the state. But luckily, Raffensperger, who's a Republican, taped it and was trying to at least be credible and do his job. And then at the same time, there were calls for the Pentagon. Well, let's see here. Trump also appointed, one of the things that Trump, you're supposed to appoint people to head different departments of government. And then Trump originally started appointing people, but then he got tired of people who weren't just yes people supporting him, which is the problem of any tyrant, by the way, is they get just loyal people around them and then they don't get any honest feedback anymore. But he got rid of the person who was head of the Pentagon and he appointed his own puppet person there. And then he basically, I think, was trying to set up something where he could then tell that person to bring out troops to support his effort to stay in power, which would be completely illegal. Okay, and there was also, so that's another thing he did, is try to put his own people who were not, near the end of his administration, they weren't confirmed by the Senate. Okay, then let's see what else here. Then there were other things too that, by the way, in the previous slide, but don't go back to it. It's just that Trump also then tried to get states that had Republicans controlling the legislature to start passing things where they would support their own group of electors. They would appoint, not that in swing states that went for Biden, they would create their own slate of alternative electors that supported Trump, even though this was basically illegal. And there were a number of states that did that as well. And that's something that's still being investigated, and hopefully that will all be brought to light. But some states, they even signed forms saying they were the legitimate, electors to the Electoral College for their state, and they were for Biden. I mean, for Trump. All right, so the extent to which Trump tried everything in the book he could think of to stay in power is really astounding. And many people say we came very close to losing our democracy. And if he got back in power, a lot of people said that'll be the end of our democracy. So, this is all very critical for our country. All right, then on January 6th was where this all came to a final head, where Trump basically, and people around him, Eastman and various people and Giuliani and so on, they invited a whole bunch of people to Washington, D.C. for a big rally. And at the end of it, Trump said, well, then go to, let's all march on the Capitol, which is where the final certification of ballots were to take place from each state. And they had also been, another thing they did is put a lot of pressure on Vice President Pence, who chairs the Senate, and who also chairs the process of certifying elections. Even though he doesn't have power over it, he just oversees it. They wanted him to claim that the votes from swing states that supported Biden should be sent back to the states and to their state legislatures, which were Republican in some cases, who would then provide, these alternative electors and challenge the election in that way and let Trump stay in power longer. So that's what was behind that plan for January 6th. And Putin, not Putin, I'm sorry, but Pence consulted with a couple other Republicans, and they said to him, one person who was a former vice president said to him, you can't do that by any means, don't do that. So legally, he decided he couldn't really do it, that he didn't have the authority to do that, even though he was getting a lot of pressure from Trump people to say that he could do that. Okay, so next. All right, then also on January 6th, one thing we still don't have all the information, but it's quite important, is that the Capitol and DC police were totally overwhelmed by what happened. And some of, there were calls for the National Guard to come in with troops. And this had to get an okay, apparently, from the Pentagon, who for 2 and 3 hours delayed that. And one of the people at the Pentagon who was a general in charge of this was Michael Flynn's brother. And Michael Flynn is someone who became a big Trump supporter and supported the, what's the group, all these conspiracy theories. What's not Al? What's the, who I'm trying to think of?
QAnon.
QAnon. Yes, exactly. Thank you. So, so anyway, Trump over time got more and more people who were really fringy that were left supporting him. He didn't, and he was just desperate to try to do anything to stay in power. But in any case, finally, after all the violence at the Capitol on January 6th, people who all had to run and try to go in hiding in their offices and other places, then they finally cleared the building, and finally other support came, and they did clear the building. And then everybody in Congress went back and they did the certification process that Biden had won. And that was kind of Trump's last gasp, he hoped. But then there was still time between January 6th and January 20th when Biden would be inaugurated. And then Trump again, the whole time after that, Trump never dealt with anything presidential. He only dealt with further ways to try to stay in power. So next. I'm, going through all this is kind of just a way of saying, sometimes we forget how bad this was, but trying to put a big picture together, I hope is showing, how out of control everything got, but how close we came to possibly losing the election if various people at different points didn't stand up and say, no, you can't do this. So, all right, so where are we here? So then after January 6th, there was a second impeachment of Trump and it was passed in the House of Representatives, again, controlled by the Democrats, but then it went once again to the Senate where they did not vote to support it because the Republicans controlled it controlled the Senate. And Republicans basically have been totally afraid to stand up to Trump. Now, in the Nixon case earlier, by the way, the Republicans finally did stand up and they did support, they finally went to Nixon and they said, if you don't resign, you're going to be impeached. And then he resigned. But there don't seem to be very many laudable Republicans left in the Republican Party. Some of them left, but the ones that stayed, who can stand up to Trump or are willing to do so, who would go to him and say, you can't keep doing this stuff. So in terms of the second impeachment, these were questions Nancy Pelosi said that should be asked. Who helped plan this January 6th insurrection? Was Trump involved and others loyal to him, which is true, Eastman, Bannon, Giuliani, and others? And who funded bringing all these people to Washington, D.C.? What extremist groups were involved? And we found out the Proud Boys, the Oath Keepers, and the One Percenters and others were all there. And they were, some of them, quite willing to use violence, and so on and so forth. So next. Can we, okay. And then, so basically there was supposed to be, they tried to first do a bipartisan commission to be appointed to investigate January 6th, but then Kevin McCarthy and the Republicans only wanted to appoint sort of more right-wing extremist Republicans loyal to Trump. And so then Pelosi finally appointed a committee, a January 6th committee within the House of Representatives by itself. But I think she smartly appointed the two Republicans who were speaking out against Trump, Liz Cheney and Adam Kinzinger, to that commission. So it is bipartisan. So there are 7 Democrats and 2 Republicans. And that committee has now interviewed over 500 people privately. They have gone to court to successfully get documents that Trump and others tried to prevent being turned over to them. They've discovered a whole lot of information, and they start with lower levels and then go up, but they are trying to put a whole big picture together about what was behind January 6th and who was involved and so on. And there are two people who also they've held in contempt of Congress. One was Steve Bannon from the beginning, and then Mark Meadows, who came out with a book and first turned over documents and then suddenly changed his tune and said, and he was chief of staff for Trump, and Trump was mad at him because of his initial cooperation with the committee. So then he totally stopped cooperating. So he's also been in contempt of Congress. And so let's see here. So that's January 6th committee, and I think it's going to be quite important, is going to hold public hearings at some point in the spring. And then they're also, because there's a November 2022 election, and there's concern that the Republicans could, amazingly, take back control of the House and they already maybe have the Senate, they could hold control. So they would make it very difficult for Biden to do any agenda after that. But the committee also definitely wants to get all their report out, a final report, before the election for sure. So I think the other question, why did Trump do everything he did? I think I've already sort of gone over it. He wants to be a dictator himself. He doesn't respect democratic traditions, but also he probably knew darn well that once he's out of office, all these lawsuits against him could go forward. So I think that's a big motivator, and that he was also raised, he has to always win and so on. Okay, next. If we can, okay. So conclusions on Trump and democracy. These are things, first, Trump is a very flawed human being. He takes pleasure in belittling others. And US has had dark periods in our history before, the Civil War, the McCarthy era, I'm sorry. We've also had a history during the Cold War supporting dictators in other countries against the Soviet Union. The Iraq War is another blight on our history, and we could go on and on. But we still hopefully have a democracy that means something, but you're not going to have it if you don't fight to keep it and try to keep making it better over time. So I would say for myself, the great strength of the US is its diversity, that we're a nation of immigrants from all over the world that all bring their knowledge and cultural and skills and views and so on, traditions to the US that makes us stronger. So we should honor that and strengthen that. That will be the future of this country. And my own vision, by the way, in when there's 2045, when there's no majority anymore, the US should become the shining example for the world of a country that functions well with a whole bunch of minorities from all different traditions who all have an opportunity to have their day in the sun, to get educated, to find jobs, or maybe if there aren't enough jobs by then, we're going to have a universal basic income, but that's another story. But anyway, the point is just that we should honor all the gifts that we get from the world's cultures and traditions that have enriched our country, that's actually our strength. Okay, so now to sum up ongoing threats to democracy that need to be addressed in the US and globally. I do think the increasing gap between rich and poor is not healthy because it's gotten too big. I mean, I'm not for everybody having exactly the same income or anything like that, but if we don't have a strong middle class, that's a difficult thing to sustain democracy. And that's something where a lot of middle class has been really hurting. And by the way, this is one thing that stunned me. I read something on Ukraine recently that because of all the refugees, people leaving their homes, everything behind, and having the buildings destroyed and everything, that there's gonna be an enormous problem of poverty for much of the Ukrainian population after this. And it's stunning, and it's a problem also in our country in many places, but that's just an aside, but it's something we have to, it's going to be on the horizon. All right. COVID, as I said, hurt minorities in our country more. But we have a situation coming up because I do future studies for years too. And we have increasing artificial intelligence, robotics, and automation. And it's a big issue in the future, whether we're going to have more jobs replacing old ones, or whether there's going to have to be some kind of universal basic income, because you can't have a sizable number of people unemployed. But that's another issue, but it is on the horizon. And we need to figure out some way to regulate social media so that total lies aren't there all the time that divide the country further and further, and are really anti-democratic and just out and out lies going on in conspiracy theories. So bottom line, US is an ongoing experiment in democracy and diversity and migration. We've always had migration. And the strength of this country is that we will rise up and be inspired by Ukraine and also try to re-strengthen our democracy. But, you know, any society may have 20, 30% possibly who could turn more right-wing against minorities and so on, but only if they feel that the system is no longer working for them. And if you have perhaps a charismatic racist leader like Trump, who by the way, he grew, his first wife said he used to have by his bedside a book about Hitler's speeches. So that should alarm people some. But anyway, so we're in still a very difficult transition period. Our democracy has been tested to the core with
yourself, person who's, yeah, the other person who's just.
I'm
can you
almost
please
done
mute
here.
yourself? Yeah.
I think
you
I'm running probably out of time, but
Yeah.
I just want to wrap up here. So we're in a very difficult transition period, which is not over by any means. And we have to strengthen our democracy, which means it has to work for everybody, not just the few. And we have to figure out how we're going to do that. And so that our democratic experiment goes on, because it is an important experiment and it's imperfect, but you know, I think it's better than a total dictatorship or authoritarian type government where the people don't have any say anymore. So I think, is there any more slide here? Yeah, the next part goes on to Ukraine, but I think I may have run out of time, right?
Well, you're not too bad, actually. Usually we kind of try and stop around 9 so that we can then have discussion, questions and answers. And
Okay.
you've still got a few minutes. If you could quickly run through your Ukraine thing, because it is so topical, that would be great.
Okay, great. Well,
And the person who's on the phone, can't read what it is now, ending up 7729, please mute your phone.
okay.
Okay.
Okay, so maybe 5-10 minutes, or would you say? Much?
Yeah. 10 at the
Okay.
most.
10. Okay, great. All right. So basically, I felt compelled to add something about Ukraine because it's on everybody's mind, and God, it's tearing at my heartstrings. I got to tell you that. But anyway, I have a background. I studied U.S. and Soviet foreign policy in graduate school. I've been to the Soviet Union on 3 different people-to-people diplomacy during the Cold War. I've gone out of my way to meet Russians at international conferences and so on. So I'm not anti-Russian people at all, you know, and they've always had a hard time. They suffered under the czars, and then they had communism, which was supposed to be for the workers and the people, but over time it became more corrupt, I think. And from everything I know, your lifestyle in the Soviet Union was based on your access to privilege, not your income. I went to Siberia even once in the middle of winter in the Cold War, you know, and met with counterparts there. And, you know, but the Russian people are human beings like anybody else, but they've had a hard time, and they've had, you know, kind of strong leaders under communism. They had some leaders, you know, they had Stalin, who totally, you know, reorganized, collectivized agriculture. And there were many Russians hurt through that, but also, you know, they've had people sent to Siberia who resisted and so on. And Brezhnev is an example of an earlier leader where he was in power too long and became kind of senile, I think. And what you've had now with Putin is somebody who's been in power for 22 years, too long. And he's tried to, and I've tried to figure out, like, what is his relation with the oligarchs? And this is really interesting, because when communism fell in 1991, then a lot of parts of the former Soviet Union, some of which were occupied at the end of World War II and just not allowed to remain independent states, became Soviet socialist republics. And then they got an opportunity in 1991 to vote whether they wanted to be independent or not. And many of them voted for independence, including Ukraine. So in Ukraine, in 1991, Ukraine became an independent country, but it's also always been called the breadbasket of the former Soviet Union. And it's also on the borders of Russia. It's a fairly big state. It also has access to the Black Sea and so on. And Russians have always, throughout their history, because they're a northern country with a lot of frozen tundra and so on, they've always wanted access to warm water ports for their security. So if they control, you know, that's one reason they, I'm sure, took Crimea in 2014. And then they wanted to take all of Ukraine, this time Putin did, to revive the old empire, but it also would give Russia access to warm water ports. And so all of those are factors behind it. But the problem with Putin is he's really become really more totalitarian than, he's now getting rid of all alternative media, any kind of way to get alternative information except for his party line. And Russia always, even under the czars, had a tradition of, giving what is called, under communism, the word propaganda was always considered a good thing, because you would give the view of what the ideal communist state of the future would be, and that would be the truth. And reality could be different. But, under the czars, even there was a story, a Potemkin village built on the side of, I don't know which river, and they took the czar on a barge down the river to this was a fake village to make it look like everything was much better than it was. So unfortunately, this tradition, I think, of supporting and repeating untruths, just to make it look good, is still with Putin. And so the Russian people are not really getting the whole story of what's going on. And they're not getting the story of how many, there's at least 7,000 Russians, and it could be a lot more that have already been killed in Ukraine. And then there's also, the motivation. I mean, the people from Ukraine and Russians, there's millions of people who have relatives on both sides, on the other side. And they're also all Slavic people. They're like their brothers, their own brothers and sisters. And so for, if they really knew that Russian troops were going in and just totally decimating civilian populations, a lot of Russian people would rise up. And there've been a lot of courageous Russians who have had public protests, and over 7,000, I don't know how many, put in jail, maybe more than Russia has jails for all of them. And then part of the Russian tradition also is that Putin doesn't want anyone challenging his authority. So with the oligarchs, when they all became very rich with the fall of communism, that was 1991. Then 2000, Putin took over as head, replaced Yeltsin as head of the country. And then he made a deal with the oligarchs, and he said to them, basically, this is what I've read, that, you can keep all your wealth and so on, but you can't challenge you shouldn't get involved with politics. And the few that did, either went to jail or, killed and so on. So there's this tradition that, opposition, democratic opposition is not allowed. And the most recent form of that was Navalny, who you probably all heard about, but, he was poisoned by Kremlin people, because he was going around trying to expose the corruption. If somebody's in power way too long and no one can challenge it. I mean, some people say Putin is possibly the wealthiest person in the world. I mean, that's how corrupt he is. Okay, so he's definitely benefited. I don't think he's a communist at all in the old sense. I think he's more like a right-wing neo-fascist, frankly. And, he's out for himself. He wants to keep his power. And he also knows as if he loses his power, just like Trump, he's going to be in deep doo-doo, because he's going to be overthrown. And, and he has this palace on the Black Sea. There's pictures of it. You can do a search for Putin's palace, and there's pictures of it. And Navalny was trying to educate the Russian people about this, and then he got poisoned. Then he went to Germany, got revived, and then he had the courage to go back to Russia. And and then he was immediately arrested and put in jail, and he was almost dying. And a lot of people in the West spoke up, and they said to Putin, if he dies, you're going to be in deep doo-doo for this, trouble. And so he's still alive, and he's been putting out messages periodically that people should protest in Russia against against so-called Putin's war in Ukraine. So Putin is trying to stay in power because he's afraid if he's not in power, what will happen. And he also has a vision of reviving the old Soviet borders of the Soviet Union, but under Russian nationalist control, I think. But the biggest issue now is there a possibility, go on to the next, I think the real issue, I'm just going to try to probably have to wrap up here, but I think one of the biggest issues is what is the basis for a peace agreement? And there is a way that Putin can say, try to negotiate, and then people will hold off hoping he will negotiate, and then he doesn't really do it, that it's just a way to stall. But the real problem is, how can there be enough concessions that Putin is willing to accept them? Because he has to appear like the big strong man, because that's the image, everyone's afraid to speak up to him. So he's not getting honest feedback. He's arrested 2 people in charge of his intelligence services And because it's their fault. You know, this is another thing Trump does, is he always blames other people. He never takes responsibility for what he created himself. But he's been more and more isolated and cut off. He's not getting good feedback. And he wanted this war to expand the old Soviet Union and bring it back under Russian control. But I think he's much more like a right-wing dictator. So, you know, oppressing his own people and gotten grossly wealthy at the expense of the Russian people. So, you know, my best scenario, I guess where I would put it here, well, whether there can be, let's go back to the, there's a big question of what terms could come for a peace agreement before, you know, Ukraine is completely demolished and tons more people are killed on both sides. But Ukraine is going to have to, for Russia is going to have to say that they won't try to become a member of NATO. And some people say that NATO's expansion of more countries is part of the problem, that Putin's doing this, that he feels Russia has to defend its security. But, you know, Russia has in various cases, by the way, when they want to win, like in Chechnya earlier, and then with Crimea, but also in, there's another, Georgia in 2008, and I'm missing a couple other in Syria and Aleppo. The Russians just go in and basically slaughter a bunch of civilians in order to get their way and win. And this is against international law, and it's totally inhumane. So, you know, you're supposed to target military targets and so on. Now, the US is obviously in our history. I don't want to get back to that now because, you know, we've not been perfect either, but I don't think we go to war and always try to just completely destroy civilian populations, but that's a whole nother thing I suppose we could discuss. But war in the bottom line is not good for anybody, and nobody really wins. Somebody may get more territory, but in the end, you know, both sides suffer, the victors and the people that got dominated. And we have to, as a human species in the nuclear age, find ways to solve our problems without going to war. So my best case scenario, and then I'll stop with this, best case scenario would be that somehow Russian troops get so bogged down and that finally they decide to withdraw, like they finally did in Afghanistan years ago. And then the foreign aid comes in to help Ukraine rebuild its country, and they get to keep their country. That opposition to Putin builds up and his mistakes in Russia, and that possibly you get more demands, and the excessive excess of the oligarchs gets also limited, and that the Russian people can create perhaps more of a less corrupt government and more democratic response to the needs of the people, the Russian people. And that maybe Navalny could be released from jail, and he would be a potential leader of the Russian people because he's shown enormous courage and he's trying to speak truth to power and show all the corruption that's happened. And that maybe they could form a constitution and so on. That would be a best case scenario. So it would help, you know, but the Russian people are going to go through a whole horrible time after this, I think, too, to get the truth to them, and then have to look at themselves, maybe a little like Germany at the end of World War II, but maybe something good eventually could come out of that. But the worst case scenario, I think, is the opposite, and maybe it'll be somewhere in between. But the worst case scenario would be that Russia continues in Ukraine, that more and more people are killed, the country's demolished, all its infrastructure, its buildings, many of its people, its families are all separated, you know, and that there's more and more refugees. It's already the biggest refugee crisis since World War II, and that Putin's brute force destroys the country completely, and that you know, Ukraine becomes under the territory of the Russian people. But I mean, the Russian under Putin control, but what's going to be left of the country? So, you know, but if what people are arguing is that Putin gets away with this once again, like he has in earlier cases, like Georgia and Syria and Crimea and so on, that he will then be encouraged to go further and take over more territory that was part of the former Soviet Union before, because he really wants to reestablish empire. So that's what's happening in Ukraine is at such big stakes. And I think Europeans have all known the dangers of war in Europe before. They've had a history of war until the end of World War II, and they don't want to see a return to war on the continent again. And I think their empathy goes out also to the Ukrainian people, as the world has. So I don't know. I think, should I go over any questions here? Do I have any more time or not?
No, I think it's time to stop the presentation, and then we have questions. Hands have already gone up on our list of names. So thank you so much for that very thorough presentation, by the way. And
this is Doc Ruby. I apologize. I wasn't able to mute my phone, but when you have a chance, please call on me. Thank you.
okay, yeah, I will. At the moment, we have 4 hands up, well, 5, including Doc Ruby, Michael, Carol Francis, Rick, and me. So Rick, your hand went up first. So if you would like to, we have about 15, 20 minutes, but as usual, everybody try and be as concise as you can, because we want to kind of get everybody in. Mm-hmm. Thank you. Rick?
Ms. Goff, thank you very much for this presentation. I thought it was really interesting. I did want to reference something that you mentioned pretty early in your presentation, where I think you talked about one of the reasons why we're getting a more vocal right wing and a more authoritarian populists, and we're hearing it more, is because of economic issues. And I did want to reference something back. I mean, one of the best times for the middle class of the United States was in the early 60s to mid 70s. And that was a time where you would have somebody like Governor George Wallace in 1969 get 5 or 6 states electoral votes in the presidential race. Some of them weren't even southern states too. So I think that that thread has been part of America. Unfortunately, maybe it's a combination of the founding based on slavery and genocide, right? And just being a thread that's gone through our founding. But I think maybe it seems more prevalent now because people have this ability now to be their own newspaper, to be their own broadcast of any position that they want. And we have not reinforced the idea of dialogue and understanding and being able to communicate ideas. It's bumper stickers, a bumper sticker mentality without any founding on logic and reasoning. And I don't know how you get past that, because I think it's been a thread in America for a long time. So I just wanted to reference that.
Okay, can I just respond real fast? Thank you very much. I agree with you. I think there's always going to be in any country, but including in our country and our traditions, a right more, but the Republican Party's gone from being conservative to more right wing under Trump. And that's what's dangerous, was when you mainstream the extreme more right wing, which is what's happened. And I think Putin tried to, diversify this country, divide it even more, polarize it even more. And that was in his interest as he saw it. But we have to figure out a way to come back a bit and create more credible conservatives, I guess you could say, as well as more progressive people, that can dialogue at least with each other, as you say, and solve problems. And you're talking about the danger of, just little sayings ruling. There's also, I think social media is still a big issue, because these conspiracy theories and extremist views, QAnon, all kinds of stuff have totally proliferated on the internet. And so far it's been hard to get Facebook and Twitter, maybe a bit more, but to find a way to monitor this. And this is an issue that's still definitely ahead of us that we have to deal with.
If I can just say really quickly, when you reference fake news, it occurred to me that that's not an answer. It's not something you say in a dialogue as part of a discussion. It's a way to shut it down.
Yes.
And the mainstream media has legitimized it. So we have to be careful about that in dialogue. We have to have reporters and journalists that will actually point that out. And I think you're absolutely right.
Yeah, but I mean, I think Trump used fake media from the day one, and he also said the media is an enemy of the people. Now, media has to play a role to hold people accountable, and so Trump tried to destroy that ability from day one. So, you know, he is the one who's the fake news. I'm sorry to say, he has been lying from day. You know, he has no difficulty lying, so to promote his own interests. So, but the problem is, how do you get back at someone who has a charismatic ability to move a group of people? I mean, I desperately hope that Trump has now done himself in by being a big Putin supporter with the, you know, Ukraine war may finally be, you know, his undoing, but we have to still see where it goes forward. Thank you.
Thank you. Ruby, I will call on you now, because otherwise I'll forget since you're not in the list.
Okay, thank you. First, I want to thank you for your facilitation, and thank Stephen right now. And Linda, that was powerful. I wasn't able to see anything, but everything is clear to me now regarding what's going on with Trump. And I'm just grateful. I hope that I will be able to see I'm not sure later. I know we you know, I'm not sure we're able to see the pictures and everything later when we can see the recording.
I hope somebody can edit it somehow, because we had difficulty, but hopefully it would be good, and then it'll be available for anybody to see.
Morgan has the capabilities. She can do it.
Okay, great. Okay.
Anyway, thank you again, everybody. And Rick, I understand what you were saying too, and but Linda, you were very clear. I just wanted to know that. Thank you.
Thank you. We still have a few more hands have got up now, actually. I think the next one to have a hand up was Michael.
Okay, I'll try to be brief. I want to give people a warning about Navalny. People need to understand that he's a critic of Putin from the right. There are two terms for Russian in Russian, and the term that he used is ethnic Russian, as opposed to a citizen of Russia. I think it's very, very dangerous. So people need to be aware of that. He's been involved with neo-Nazi protests in Russia by skinheads. So I just want to give that cautionary note.
Thank you very much for that, because I need to research his background.
Yeah. Somebody had designated him as a political prisoner, and they withdrew the designation because of his involvement in hate speech. I think that what you laid out about the worldwide trend of authoritarianism is correct. But I think it's what Rick said. It's related to the fact that there's a global crisis of capitalism, and the response has mainly been a right-wing response of trying to return to ethnic nationalism. And I think that's what Trump represents here. Modi, with his Hindu nationalism, I think it is very authoritarian, but it's rooted in that economic crisis, and which is a weakness of his current system. I also want to say that there's a danger about looking to the middle class, because historically in those kinds of capitalist crises, the middle class is a source of fascism and fascist reactionary responses. And I don't think that we can rely on the middle class. I think we have to rely on working people. I think the best case scenario would be the overthrow of the current Russian system and restoration of socialism there and elsewhere in the world. I think that the other thing about Putin is that he has consciously, for many years, tried to, it's not just with Trump, but he's had conferences in Russia with similar ethno-nationalists around the world, right-wingers from the United States, and he puts himself forward as a white Christian. And part of his critique is that the U.S. is too absorbed with degeneracy and transgender and gay rights and so on. So I think that people need to pay attention to all those aspects of patriarchal capitalism that he represents. That's all.
Okay, can I just give a quick response? I hear everything you say, Michael. Thank you, and thank you for the tech help as well. But I wanted to just say that, in terms of the middle class and everything, and going to the working class only. I mean, if we have a country, it has to somehow represent all the people, and if it doesn't, and that includes different ethnic groups as well as not extreme social class differences, but we have to figure out how we have a country that people all are committed to keeping going. But I do think that one of the problems right now is it's some of the working class who voted for Obama and then they voted for Trump. And they are some of it's like in the old lumpen proletariat, if you want to go back to Marxism,
Sure.
where they support right-wing things. And so it's the
Yeah.
working class is not automatically going to solve democracy problems.
I did want to say one other thing, actually. I think that in my mind, Bill Clinton, Hillary Clinton, Obama, and Biden are as sociopathic as Trump. They're just slicker about it.
All right, well,
at that point, can we go on to the next question?
Yeah.
I'm sorry, but we have six
all right,
hands up still, and we have limited time. In fact, we're going to have to start combining questions. So Anthony, Fernando, could you each ask your question briefly together, and then Linda can kind of reply to you, and then we'll do the same thing with the other two, which is me and Carol Francis. Okay, so Fernando first, if you could just quickly say your question, followed by Anthony.
Yeah, basically, thank you for your presentation. Though I'm a bit confused because you have, seems to me that you have two topics that it's not too clear to me. Maybe because of my English is my second language. But nevertheless, what is I guess my question is that because it's hard to understand many of these issues. We talk about dictatorship of Putin, but it's kind of hard to just throw words around and so forth. While here, they banded many of these like a YouTube area, like particularly the Russian television is canceled and so forth. And when we talk about democracy and so forth, but I guess my question with you is that in regard of Russia, because as far as I know, I mean, I'm not an expert about this. There's a Minsk agreement. Even Gorbachev is talking about this. This is an issue that agreement between different countries, including the United States, that with that agreement, the United States have no right to move because that's part of the agreement when they folded the Soviet Union, and including the Ukrainian and many other states. But since then, since they signed the agreement under Gorbachev, the United States continue to expand in a sense, using
Excuse me, Fernando, you're actually asking about the kind of the growth of NATO. That's what you're asking about. It's just time is really short. Yeah. So that's what you wanted to answer about. Is that okay?
Maybe to make it short, what is your understand? Because I look at it this way, in scientific way, in any action, there's also an opposite reaction. And so we need to explain what is particularly the position of the US and the Russian, so we can understand basically, so we don't have this misunderstanding, because what I hear here is so much talk, but really not enough credibility in terms of information and so forth. Maybe let me just put it that way.
Okay, thank you. And Anthony, if you could very briefly kind of bring up your point.
Yeah, I'll try. Two quick questions. One is about the role of religion, and I shared with on the listserv about Diana. There's a lot of interference. I can't hear myself speak. Could someone mute themselves?
Interview.
Okay. All right.
I'm on the phone with them right now.
Okay, so
I'm sorry.
All right. All right. So one of the questions I had is about the role of religion. Diana Butler Bass wrote a really interesting article, and it sort of reinforces something of what Michael said. that behind this conflict is also a religious dimension, which we at ICUJP need to be aware of and respond to. The Russian Orthodox Church versus the Ukrainian Orthodox Church and the different attitudes that they have politically, theologically. I think these are really important. So I wanted to bring that up with Linda. The second is, what is our response? There's a very active peace movement. 14,000 people have been arrested. I don't think that seems to be significant that there's that much opposition in Russia to the war in Ukraine. What is our response other than to send arms to, when I say our, I mean the United States, the European response? Is there a nonviolent approach that could help the Ukraine resist the invasion by Russia? Obviously, I think there probably is, but have you given that some thought, Linda? Thanks.
Thank you. Linda, if you can possibly briefly just kind of encapsulate those three questions actually, two from Anthony, one from Fernando, that would be great.
The first one is about NATO expansion and the question about whether that is what is behind Putin, and what that there are various people making that argument that Russia's always had security issues and that it feels that it needs to maintain control of Ukraine in order to be secure within Russia. I guess that that is an argument you could make to defend Putin, but Putin is also just blatantly killing civilians, and this is not even, this is not a decent war when you start doing that. But then the next part opposite of that is the right of the Ukrainian people, who in 1991, along with many other former parts of the Soviet Union, declared their independence and they voted in their own country. They chose to have an independent country. So do they have a right to do that, or does Putin have a right to tell Ukraine how to live their future in their life? That's sort of an issue at stake. Okay, is it Russian security that should dominate, or the right of the Ukrainian people? And that's not an easy thing to resolve, but that's underlying this whole thing. Then the role of religion, I will look into that. Anthony, thank you for that. If you have a good article on that, would you send it to me, about the Ukraine versus Russian Orthodox? The Russian Orthodox Church, by the way, can be quite conservative. I went to a lot of interfaith conferences, and I went to a dinner once where I sat next to someone from a Russian Orthodox Church, and I didn't think he had, this was where religion was trying to reassert itself in Russia after the fall of communism, but I don't think he had a clue about what interfaith was about. I will just say that. So, but send me what you have. And then in terms of Russia, this is a huge issue about whether nonviolence would work against Putin, just like there was an issue in the past whether nonviolent struggle would work against Hitler. And I think, Gandhi did say that people have a right to defend themselves. And that, if somebody's trying to annihilate them, they have a right to defend themselves and even possibly use violence. Obviously nonviolence would be preferable, but when somebody's coming in and targeting your whole population centers, and you have a zillion refugees trying to flee the country so the children will survive, and the buildings are all being destroyed. I don't know that Putin at this point is going to respond to nonviolent resistance. I think that's a huge question to discuss. But I have maybe a few doubts about Putin, because his desire to reestablish the expanded borders of the old Soviet Union, I think, is a pretty big motivation here.
Thank you. Carol Francis, the same again. If you can make yours as short
I'll be as short as possible.
And mine is very short. Don't worry about mine.
I was with you for I think most of us were with you on most of what you said, but when you said that you don't believe the US goes in and destroys other people, I just what?
I didn't say that. I didn't say
it's similar.
No, okay, now go ahead. Yeah, I'll respond to that.
I was just like, the US is far worse than Russia as far as our history. As far as the right of the Ukrainian people to have their own government, yes, but do they have the right to bring NATO in, to have NATO missiles on the Russian border aimed at Russia? I don't think the US would be perfectly happy with Mexico or Canada doing something like that. And I think that we need to look at that we're dwelling on Ukraine as if it was the most horrific thing that ever happened, at the same time ignoring what's happening in Yemen by US missiles and US armaments, and Palestine, the refugees from Palestine. I think we need to keep our perspective. What's happening in the Ukraine is horrible, but keep it in perspective of what the US is doing to other countries. And also, I put in the chat a link. You'll see it. It's in blue, and it's to a talk by Brian Becker and Abby Martin, and really suggest everybody you can click on it right now and then watch it at your leisure, because it will be on your.
Thank you. And
Go ahead.
sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
Mine is not really even a question. It's just very short. It's just that I think we are all underestimating the amount of female support that Trump has. It's not just old white men. Marjorie Taylor Greene is the perfect example. But again and again, I'm seeing more and more of these female politicians who are total Trumpers, who seem to be more extreme in some ways than the men. That's just a comment, doesn't need a reply. It's just something I think we need to be more aware of. Anyway, thank you, Linda. Back to you.
Let me just try to respond to Carol Francis. Yes, we have a history of intervening around the world. We have supported, as I said, dictators through the whole Cold War because they were against the Soviet Union during the whole Cold War. We have a bad history, but I don't know if US, well, I don't even want to, this is dangerous territory. But there is supposed to be, if you go to war, you're supposed to attack military targets and airports. And when you very consciously can't win that way, and you go in and you try to just attack civilian populations, this is against international law. Now, I'm not saying we have a perfect record. That's far from it. And I tried to, at the beginning, show that we are very imperfect. Human beings are imperfect. We're all imperfect, and we try to figure out how to do better. But I'm not trying to justify all of our history. Obviously, we've had, I said that at the very beginning, and also through the Cold War, we supported dictators. So there's all of that there. But
the U.S. does do that.
Okay, this is a long discussion. Okay, so we have to try to quickly respond here. But I do think that Russia under Putin has had a history of going into various places, and people keep mentioning them. Syria, Aleppo was bombed. The Chechnya wanted independence and was stopped. Then there's also Georgia, various cases where Russia has tried to just destroy population centers and people. And this is not a great tradition. I'm just pointing that out. Okay, and it would have been better if they could try to attack military targets. All right. And then in terms of female support, yes, Marjorie Taylor Greene is bizarre. And, even some Republicans are now speaking out against her, but that's, I think that the thing that people are talking about is women in Ukraine are speaking up and going in and fighting for their independence. And that is a different side of than Marjorie Taylor Greene, but women, like men, have to figure out where they are. And I think people who are raised in a very conservative religious tradition where women are supposed to be secondary and not speak up, maybe those are some of the women who've been supporting Trump because that's what their religious leaders have been telling them to do. I think there's a bit of a crisis of right-wing Christianity too, to come to terms with what they have been doing.
Yeah.
Anyway, I just thank you all for letting me present this. There's a zillion topics we could discuss here. I just did my best to try to present some of them, and I appreciate all of you and the work that you do. And carry on, please.
Thank you very much. Absolutely. Thank you. And it would be lovely. I mean, in the questions, there were so many future meetings that I could just see coming up. I mean, if we hold on to some of those questions, we could have a whole meeting around them. And if not the presenter, I'd love you to be in it as a participant. Mm-hmm. I think there's just so much to discuss and think about here. But meanwhile, the clock is ticking.
Oh, can I add one more thing in response to Carol Francis? I mean, empires are a problem everywhere. The U.S. has had its empire, and I hope it's not, we're getting a little bit beyond that, but we had a Roman Empire in the past, we had ancient empires, we have a Russian Empire now, we had a British Empire, and every one of these empires eventually has people in it that rise up and want more of their own freedom and independence. So that's the big, issue, and hopefully we're getting to be an age beyond empires, but that's a big question. So I don't know if that's any additional response.
Yes,
people who are heads of empires, who have nobody they consult with, who have absolute power, like Putin has had, then he doesn't get a lot of feedback, and people are afraid to speak up to him, just like the whole Republican Party being afraid to speak up to Trump. So this is not good. This is not a good tradition. That's all I'll say.
Right. Any other organizations people want to speak about, notices or anything? If not, then we'll go to our closing circle. Anybody who wishes to lift up somebody.
I'll lift up the Ukrainian people and the Russian people.
Thank you. Anyone else?
Yes, I'm lifting up the leaders of the world to come together to support the end of this war and all wars. And also just our people, the United States, in right action.
I would like to lift up the people of Yemen.
Yeah.
I would like to reiterate what Stephen said in his reflection. Let us always reach out for love.
I'll reiterate both Carol Francis and Linda. I do think that the 14,000 political prisoners in Russia now who spoke out against the war and got arrested for it are an example. But I think that we should also lift up the Palestinians who've been facing exactly the same kind of destructive bombing of civilian targets as the Ukrainians, and have been, pretty much abandoned by the West. I put it in the chat. I think if the kind of BDS that's been directed at Russia had been directed at Israel by civil society and governments, Israeli apartheid would have ended a long time ago. And I think that we need to have a uniform moral and political code across the board, not based on who the U.S. is allied with strategically or in any other way.
Can I
Yes,
go ahead. Sorry.
Yes, I wanted to lift up, the people, not just in Ukraine, but the people around the world, because this is what happened when communication, collapsed, and we don't really understand each other and so forth. And so this is, then it becomes a war. And so I wanted to lift that, to have more understanding, even our own biases and so forth, because without that, then we continue to have discrimination, racism, and it end up become a systemic problem. That's what we have now, and so forth. Thank you.
Thank you. And Anthony, thank you so much for agreeing to see us out.
Sympathy can arise in unusual settings. I had a group of wonderful moving people who moved our home and furniture and boxes and boxes up here to Sonoma County. And the head guy was a wonderful man named Omar. And you spend a lot of time with these fellows. And toward the end, he told me that his 28-year-old son died of a heart attack. And we discussed that at some length. And my heart immediately went out to him. And I think in our lives, we have those moments of grief that are not necessarily connected to longstanding friendships or family, but to people we only glancingly meet let alone people we never meet, like the victims around the world. So for my moment today, I want to lift up Omar's son.
Thank you.
Can I just say one little thing here, which is that one reason Ukraine is getting so much publicity, though I totally agree. I mean, there's all different parts of the world where people are being oppressed and suffering and so on, and they don't get the same publicity. And it's very valid to say, why is that? I mean, I think one of the things is it's European itself. The whole order since World War II is now kind of being thrown up for grabs and so on, but also the media is there. The media is there, and it seems like a lot of Ukrainian people also speak English. And so therefore we're hearing their story every day on the news, which is not happening with all the other places around the world where people are also suffering and where there's a lot of refugees and other crises happening. So I totally acknowledge that.
We should welcome all media, even if we don't like it, to even here, because they just ban, this communication media like
Right.
RT and many other left movement. And so when we do that, then we also disfranchise ourselves. Just to respond to you.
You know, I hate to be hard, but we've actually overrun our time and there's a board meeting to follow. So I think I actually have to move on and ask Anthony now to close us out. Thank you so much, Anthony.
Okay, well, thank you so much for inviting me. I'm going to share with you a comment by Thomas Merton that speaks to my condition. He says, peace demands the most heroic effort and the most difficult sacrifice. It demands greater heroism than war. It demands greater fidelity to the truth and a much more purity of conscience. Spirit of peace and justice and love, guide us as we try to discern how to respond to war in the Ukraine, as well as in Yemen, Palestine, and other parts of the world. We pray for the systemic changes needed to stop not just this war, but the war machine that profits from this evil. Help us to courageously and persistently stand against all forms of violence and injustice, and to reach out in love to the victims of war, as well as to the war makers and the peacemakers. As William Penn once said, let us try what love can do.